Now, as the Western Allies are advancing in France and through Normandy, the Soviets prepare to launch their grand offensive in the east, and this is called Operation Bagration. Operation Bagration. Now, when they met in Tehran in December of 1943, they had decided that when the Americans invaded France, the Russians would coordinate and launch a major offensive in the east as well. They were hoping this would be launched pretty much at the same time, but in any event, the Russians don't actually launch this operation until June 22nd. So D-Day is on June 6th. Operation Bagration is June 22nd. What is the significance of June 22nd? Operation Barbarossa. The Germans invade on June 22nd, 1941. This is 3 years to the day of Operation Barbarossa. Okay? Now, Hitler and OKH, the Oberkommando der Heers, commanding the army in the east, they don't believe a major Soviet assault is imminent. Now remember, after Kursk, the Germans are pretty much playing defense in the east, right? And they think the Russians are launching local counterattacks and stuff like that, but they don't think there's going to be a major attack anytime soon, okay? German Foreign Armies East, German intelligence there in the east, they predicted that if an attack comes of any significance, they're primarily going to hit up toward Leningrad in the north or toward in Ukraine in the south, where the Germans primarily had their allies. Again, you've got Romanians, Hungarians, etc., on their flanks. And so that's where they're expecting. If the Russians come, they're going to come in the extreme north or the extreme south. Now, Hitler believed that when the Italians left the war because of military reverses, Hitler believed Stalin would then try to attack German allies again. He'd try to hit Finns, he'd try to hit the Hungarians, Romanians, in the hopes of driving them out of the war as well, right? Prior to this operation, the Soviets ordered their partisans, right, their resistance movements behind the line, to attack railroads, to harass Wehrmacht units where they could. The Soviets, just like the Allies, the Western Allies, with Operation Fortitude and the Deception Army, the Soviets employ maskirovka, which is essentially the Russian word for deception. They employ deception as well, deception measures. They want the Germans to think a major assault, or at least a pretty big assault, will happen in Ukraine. They want them to think they're coming for Ukraine. And again, just like in the West, there are very few Luftwaffe planes available to do reconnaissance. So they can't really confirm any buildups. And what few planes make it up to do reconnaissance, the Soviets are pretty successful in shooting them down. Now, the German army here in the center of, this is where the blow is going to come, the German Army Group Center. Opposite them, the Soviets are massing for this massive attack here. Red Army. These are the leaders of Bagration. Georgy Zhukov, Konstantin Rokossovsky. We've talked a lot about both of these guys before, but they are key players in this victory here over the Germans of Bagration. Stavka had managed to assemble 1,670,000 men in 5 armies. 1,670,000 men in 5 armies. As part of this force, the Soviets had nearly 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. They had more than 30,000 regular artillery pieces and mortars. 30,000 artillery pieces and mortars. And they had massed about 7,500 aircraft. About 7,500 aircraft. By contrast, Army Group Center is a shadow of what it had been before. Its strength is less than 500,000 men. Its strength is less than 500,000 men. An entire army group has about 120 serviceable tanks. 120 serviceable tanks. Remember, the tank was always the bedrock of the German advance of the Panzer Division. They've got about 120. They've got less than 4,000 heavy guns. Less than 4,000 heavy guns. and less than 1,000 aircraft. Less than 1,000 aircraft to cover the entirety of the center of the line here. On June 22nd, the Soviets began with a heavy bombardment of German positions for 3 hours before these Soviet armies began crashing into the German units. And Hitler, true to form, tells all of his generals, no retreats, no retreats, no retreats. On June 26th, Hitler, he appoints, so Ernst Busch had been the commander of Army Group Center. He relieves Ernst Busch, and he appoints Walter Model, Field Marshal Walter Model. Model kind of had a reputation of being a fireman. They often called him Hitler's fireman, because whenever it looked like the enemy would break through, they'd send him, he'd reorganize an aggressive defense, and they'd put out the fire, right? So Model is able to do these things here. There's also something else that happens. Hitler would frequently order no retreat for his generals. A general would retreat or would threaten to retreat, Hitler would fire him. And then he would bring up another general and he'd put him in that place, and the first thing that general will tell him is, we have to retreat. And then Hitler would say, okay. Hitler frequently does. And that's what he does here. Model convinces Hitler they need to retreat. They need to retreat. And so Hitler says, okay, he allows for limited retreats along the line. But the Red Army assaults here are just ferocious. And the Germans, as they are retreating, are forced to abandon all types of equipment and vehicles. And during this fighting here in Bagration, 7 German generals are killed in the fighting. Generals. 7 generals are killed in the fighting here. Does anybody know what Bagration means? What that is? Bagration was a Russian general during the Napoleonic War. He's one of the generals that expelled the French from Russia. But this Operation Bagration, completely destroys Army Group Center. It completely destroys Army Group Center. And what else is significant here? And this is about a 2-month battle. This lasts from June to August. And what else is interesting here is that for the first time since Barbarossa, virtually the entirety of Soviet territory is liberated. They push the Wehrmacht back into Poland. They push the Wehrmacht back into Poland to the very gates of Warsaw. To the very gates of Warsaw. Now, to give you an idea, too, of how devastating this was for the Germans, in the year prior to Bagration, the Germans lost a total of 41 divisions on the Eastern Front. So over a course of a year, they lost 41 divisions on an Eastern Front, okay? In the 2 months of Bagration, the Germans lost, Army Group Center had 34 divisions total. The Germans lose 28 divisions, completely destroyed, 28 divisions out of 34 on the Eastern Front. In the previous year, it took a year to destroy 41, right? Now, one other thing that's very notable here about Bagration, there is simply no way the Soviets could have launched this attack without Lend-Lease aid. Specifically, what gives the Russians their mobility here are Studebaker trucks. The United States sends the Soviets just tons of Studebaker trucks. And these Studebaker trucks are absolutely essential to the Soviet victory. Absolutely essential to the Soviet victory. I think I mentioned this before. Sean McMeekin, in his book Stalin's War, he says that. He says when you look at Bagration, you look at Kursk, you look at Stalingrad, he says you can't just say these are Soviet victories. These were Allied victories because the Soviets fought with Allied equipment, right? And they probably wouldn't have won without that equipment, at least some of these battles. Certainly Bagration would not have been the success story it was without mobility here. Yeah, that was pretty much it. The Soviets were notorious for not giving any operational details. Occasionally, they'd say, oh, we've destroyed X number of German divisions. They'd say stuff like that, but they wouldn't say, we're going to send, the 15th Division to take out this, and they weren't communicating with us. And we weren't really doing that too, but there was much greater openness on our part toward the Soviets about planning than there was on the Soviets toward us. Stalin remains very paranoid of the West, right? So, as I say, the Red Army is right at the gates of Moscow, or right at the gates of Warsaw. And as these tanks are approaching, the the Home Army, what was called the Home Army. This is the Polish resistance. Remember, Poland has a government in exile in London, but they're still very much in contact with their home army, the Polish resistance in Poland. So the local Polish resistors decided it was time to rise up, to move against the German occupiers, okay? So we have now the Warsaw Uprising, and this begins August 1st and it lasts until October of 1944. Now this is not to be confused with something else called the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and I didn't really discuss that too much. In 1943, as they're deporting Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto, the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto have an uprising that kill a lot of Germans in the ghetto. But what we have here is Polish resistors decide to rise up against the Wehrmacht. You can see this is a German half-track, and you've got Poles. They got a Polish flag there. They commandeered that German half-track. You can see these soldiers here. She's got a German helmet on, right? Because they're just grabbing whatever they can to fight with here. Now the Polish. They begin to fight back, and initially they're fighting back with small arms, Molotov cocktails, but again, they get their hands on more and more of these weapons here. Their assumption was the Soviets are about to liberate us. We're going to cause as many problems as we can for the Soviets, for the Germans, as the Soviets approach. However, instead of racing to help this uprising and to liberate Warsaw, Stalin orders the Red Army to halt its operations just short of Warsaw. He orders to halt the operations just short of Warsaw. Now, part of the reason is because these resistors are linked to the Polish government in exile in London. And Stalin, ever since the Katyn massacre, he is at odds with the Polish government. He's at odds with the Polish government. Instead, as he goes into Poland, he grabs his own Polish communists to create his own government that he wants to put into power once they're in there. And he wants to see the Germans and the Polish Home Army kill each other. Because he thinks if those Poles that are fighting against the Nazis, if they're still in positions of power when he comes in, they'll fight against him. So his position is just let them kill each other. Just let them kill each other. Now, when the ghetto uprising of 1943 happened, the Germans just gut the ghetto. They destroy the ghetto. They level the ghetto. They kill every Jew there. They ship the ones they find in concentration camps. They just destroy this little section of Warsaw. Now, you see that same destruction visited on the entire city. The entire city of Warsaw just faces this massive, massive destruction here. And you have SS and police units here are involved in this. You can see this is where it's taking place. But the suppressing is conducted by Erich von dem Bach-Zawelski. And Bach-Zawelski he'd been heavily involved in the Holocaust in more efficient ways to kill Jews. He'd been involved in that. And now he is leading this just destruction of the city of Warsaw over the course of these 2 months against these resistors. Now, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill were begging Stalin, you need to help the Poles. You need to continue the advance. You need to help the Poles. And when Stalin says, no, I've overrun my supply lines, which was not entirely inaccurate. His supply lines were stretched to the limit. He's saying, but he still could have done more here. Obviously, he still could have done more, but he chose not to. But he's saying, my supply lines are stretched to the limit. I have to look out for my own people. I can't engage in this. And then they say to him, Churchill and Roosevelt say, okay, let us do airdrops. We want to fly planes over Warsaw to drop weapon supplies on these people. But we can't, it's so far, we can't bring our planes back. We want to be able to land our planes on Soviet territory. And he says, no, you'll not land on my territory. Heinrich Himmler will order Zawelski to, as I say, completely level the city, to completely destroy the city. And so that's what they're doing. The German army is just blowing up everything in the city, murdering people left and right. Himmler actually commented to Hitler that the Polish uprising was actually a good thing, as it allowed the Germans to completely destroy Polish culture, under the cover of war. Here we can destroy their culture, and we can use the war as an excuse. We can use this military thing here as an excuse, this military operation as an excuse. in this battle, the ensuing massacre, nearly 200,000 Poles are killed in the uprising, or casualties, I should say. 200,000 Poles are casualties. 200,000 Poles are casualties. The Germans lose about 26,000 men casualties. 26,000 men as casualties. Has anybody seen The Pianist? It's a good film. It's about a Jew who he's Polish and he kind of hides from the Nazis, and he's like right in the middle of this. And you see the destruction of Poland. And like one of the final shots of the film is it pulls out, and you just see Warsaw just in ruins. Warsaw's just devastated. But going back here to the Western Allies, so they actually go ahead and fairly quickly after they take Paris, they start to move up here into northwestern France or northeastern France, and into Belgium, as you can see here. So it's a pretty much from the breakout at Cobra at the end of July until about early September, it's pretty much just movement. And by that point, by September, we're at the gates of Germany itself, just south of the Netherlands, of Holland. But there's a major problem. We moved so fast that we have outrun our ability to supply our armies. We're still getting the bulk when we're up here. We're still getting the bulk of our heavy equipment is coming through Cherbourg. And so that is a huge distance that our trucks have to travel. So beginning on the 25th of August, as our armies are starting to push out there, supply officers, they begin to set up this kind of truck convoy system that's going, direct from Port of Cherbourg to the front lines here. The system was known as the Red Ball Express. The Red Ball Express. And the Red Ball Express essentially will be in operation until November, when we can finally liberate Antwerp, Belgium. So we can finally liberate Antwerp, Belgium. That gives us a much closer, and it's not just the Antwerp itself, we have to take the Scheldt, and I'll get into that later. Late August until November, the Red Ball Express is what's keeping our armies moving forward. At its peak, the Red Ball Express operated just under 6,000 trucks, and they were driven, loaded, and unloaded primarily, not exclusively, but primarily by African-American troops. And every day, the Red Ball Express transported roughly 12,500 tons of supplies. So this is a massive, massive undertaking here. All right, now, so the U.S. First Army, who's the commander of the First Army? Who's the commander of the U.S. First Army? Courtney Hodges. So the U.S. First Army is approaching the lines here. As we get to the close to the German border there, we encounter the Hurtgen Forest. Now, this forest had been part of what was called the Siegfried Line. Now, when the French built the Maginot Line in the 1930s, the Germans responded by building kind of a counterwall called the Siegfried Line. But the Siegfried Line, over the course of the war, it had been cannibalized. A lot of the guns and what have you been taken from there because it wasn't needed after France fell. And they'd used it in other places. But now, as the Allies are approaching the Siegfried Line, the Germans are refortifying it. And so much of the Siegfried Line runs through the Hurtgen Forest here. And Hodges is not particularly inventive or an imaginative commander. He actually said at one point, why are you taking so much time and effort to try to get around the enemy? You just go right at him, which is often a recipe for disaster here. He has a really good relation with Collins, whom I mentioned before, J. Lawton Collins, the 7th Army Corps commander. He really, because he kind of depends on Collins. Collins is the guy that was spearheading that race across northwest France in the preceding months, and northeast France. And Collins is good. Collins is a really good commander. And so Hodges knows this, and he gives him a lot of slack, and he leans on him. But, and I would argue that what successes the First Army have at this time period we're discussing is really due to Hodges. Now, the other corps commanders were decent. They weren't as good as him. They were decent. But the problem is Hodges does not create something that Eisenhower really prized, and that is a happy family. And what they mean by the happy family is, again, this is something Frendendal couldn't do in North Africa, meaning his subordinates and he don't get along, they're not on the same page, they're not working together like they need to work. That's a happy family. And so he did not create a happy family here. Hodges is frequently berating and threatening his corps commanders here. And what's more, too, is by this point, too, by November, the early November, the supply, actually beginning in September and then through November, the supply problem, even with the Red Ball Express, is becoming very, very acute. On November 5th, Eisenhower writes to his logistics officer, Brahan B. Somerville, and he details the Army's requirements. So Eisenhower's saying what his Army needs here. Quote, spectacular quantities of ammunition are consumed in the European campaign, particularly during major offensives. He explained that each month his forces consumed, quote, 6 million rounds of artillery and 2 million rounds of mortar ammunition, and that these numbers increased as more and more troops arrived at the front. In the Hurtgen here, we one of the first big objectives is the German city of Aachen. Does anybody know what the historical significance of Aachen is? Prior to this, that was Charlemagne's capital. The French, well, he would consider himself a Roman emperor, but crowned emperor on Christmas Day, 800 A.D. And he made his capital in Aachen. Well, anyway, for the Allied effort to take Aachen, the First Army had expended over 300,000 rounds of 105 millimeter howitzer shells over the course of 2 weeks. 300,000 shells over the course of 2 weeks. Quote, more than 750 million pounds of ammunition have been expended during the campaign. 750 million pounds of ammunition have been expended during the campaign. 4,000 to 5,000 pounds a minute, every minute, 24 hours a day, are required to support operations. That's just insane. That is just an insane amount of ordnance you're using. Now the Hurtgen, the problem here with the Hurtgen is you've got these really, really dense forests, sharp ridges, narrow roads, and you got to remember what is making the American army so powerful and strong and effective here in Northwest Europe at this time is it is essentially doing what the Germans did at the beginning of the war, right? Blitzkrieg tactics, mobility, pincer movements, getting around, pushing. I mean, its speed, its mobility, combined with its air power, is the key to success. But now you're in the Hurtgen forest. There's no mobility here. And more than that, your air power is nullified because you can't see where to drop your bombs because of all the trees, right? So this is, a lot of commentators have stated they really should have bypassed the Hurtgen. They should have gone around it, kind of sealed it off, and starved out the Germans instead of going headlong in there. The United States First Army, and it's funny because Bradley is a micromanager. And Bradley is actually kind of working with Giraud, who is another corps commander, in trying to essentially have regimental dispositions. You got an Army Group commander working on regimental dispositions. This isn't his job. This is a division commander's job. Not a corps, not an army, you know. And Hodges signs off on this stuff, but like there's one instance where, you know, each of these divisions, how many regiments are in a division? Remember? Right at the beginning of class we discussed this. How many regiments are in a division? Yeah, 3, exactly, 3. The idea is for a triangular division, because remember, in World War I, it was 4 regiments, right? And it was to give you kind of this power to push through a trench. But here we have 3 divisions. And the idea is one division fixes the enemy. They attack the enemy, they're fixed. The other division, the second division, tries to find the flank of the enemy, tries to find their side that they can push on. And then the third is held in reserve, and whichever other division is making progress, that one reinforces to push through. That's the theory here of the triangular division, okay? What they're doing here in Hurtgen is, I can't remember which division. I want to say it's the 4th, but I could be mistaken. they actually assign 3 different missions to the 3 different infantry regiments. And that's completely contrary to their own doctrine, right? But they're too ambitious, they're trying to get too much done, and it just leads to a lot of problems here. So the United States First Army in the Hurtgen suffers about 24,000 casualties over the course of a series of engagements here for a couple of months here in the Hurtgen. And in addition to that, there were about another 10,000 non-combat related casualties. About 10,000 non-combat related casualties. This is one of the few major battles of the war where the Germans suffer fewer casualties than the Allies. Okay, the Germans suffer few, and because again, the Germans are making good use of the terrain. They're making good use of the what's left of the Siegfried line. They're doing quite well there. But there's another issue here. As the Battle of Hurtgen is going on, we have another issue that's going on further north here. Oh, so there's some images there of the Hurtgen. I'm not going to really get into that right here, but we have this further thing going north here. I'm going to explain it here. Okay, so as we're moving into the Hurtgen here, further north, we've got this issue up here. Now, we've got Antwerp. We actually take Antwerp. We need Antwerp because this is a massive port, okay? We need Antwerp, and this is a port. Now, we're going to launch a pretty ambitious drive here, and some people will say that the big point of this drive is actually to kind of go into here, and there's Aachen there, and to take Germany through over the Rhine up here. Now, that's part of this offensive we're going to talk about. But one of the big reasons why we're going to commission this is, even though we hold Antwerp, which is this big port, you can see it's the end of this river here, even though we've got the port, we can't use it. We can't use it because this is the Scheldt right here, okay? And the Scheldt is this, like, these, it's right here between Belgium and Holland, and you can see it's where all these kind of rivers come out into the sea. But the problem is you've got these almost like fingers kind of dangling out into the sea here, and the Germans occupy those fingers. If we try to bring shipping in there, they can just blast it with artillery, and so we can't open Antwerp. We've got to take these units and neutralize the Scheldt before we can actually really proceed with the rest of the operation. So this is the plan. We need to punch further up here. We want to take some bridges here at Arnhem, at Nijmegen, to get across the Ruhr and to get into Germany. But we also want to isolate these units here, starve them out, so that we can get this supply crisis will be ameliorated, right? We need to get supplies there. And as good a job as the Red Ball Express is doing, it just can't compete with having a heavy water port really close to our front lines, okay? And the 21st Army, or the 21st Army Group under Montgomery, that's their sector. Now, Montgomery, as we know, is a very cautious general. And yet he amazes the Americans when he comes up with a very ambitious plan. And this plan is called Operation Market Garden. Operation Market Garden. Operation Market Garden has 2 parts. It's got a parachute drop part. This is called Market. And it's got a ground assault called Garden. So this is where we get Market Garden from. We have 3 airborne divisions will participate. You have the British 1st Airborne Division under Roy Urquhart, and it is charged with taking the bridge at Arnhem, which is the key bridge over the Rhine. And then as we get further south, we have the American 82nd Airborne under James Gavin, General James Gavin, who's a fairly young general. And he, I think Gavin's at Nijmegen, I think, if I remember correctly. And then the other bridge is, I can't remember the name of the other bridge. It'll come to me. But this was taken by the 101st Airborne Division under Maxwell Taylor, General Maxwell Taylor. Maxwell Taylor will later be the Chief of Staff, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 60s. But the plan here is this. The British and the Americans are going to launch these airborne units to capture the bridges. Because the fear is, as we approach the bridges, the Germans will blow them up, right? So the idea is we're going to land 3 divisions to capture the bridges. Now, an airborne division, essentially has a lot of light equipment. You can't take heavy artillery or tanks with an airborne division. Not like this, right? They're going to take these three spots, these three areas deep behind German lines, right? They're going to capture these deep behind German lines. Then the second part of the plan, Garden, is we've got the British 30th Corps under Brian Horrocks. The British 30th Corps under General Brian Horrocks, British general. His plan then is to just punch through the Germans as hard as he can to link up with these American and British airborne units, and that way we can just punch a straight line like a spear through the Germans, linking up with these paratroopers, and we can have we'll be able to capture the bridges intact. Now, they actually described this as, I think as Horrocks described this, he said, think of the paratroopers as the homesteaders in the American West, and they're besieged by the Indians. And then we, the 30th Corps, are the cavalry. We're racing to save the homesteaders, right? That was the analogy that the British use here. As I say, it's an incredibly ambitious plan. But as it's approaching, we have something here that's going to settle in that's kind of an idea in kind of military studies called mission creep. Okay? And what that means is you come up with a plan, but then even as the plan maybe doesn't look like it's going to work, or the objectives of the plan have been superseded by events, you still go ahead with the plan anyway, even though it doesn't really make sense to do it now. Well, what's going to happen is intelligence is going to find, when this is planned, it's under the assumption there's not a lot of very strong German presence in the region. But we get increasing intelligence that there is a lot of German presence, particularly around Arnhem. But they kind of talk it off. They say, no, it's, and this plan, between the time it's created and the time it is executed, is really short. It's just like a couple of weeks. I mean, it's really a short time. So when you think of D-Day, which they've been planning for years, and then something like this, it's just, they're going really fast here. Eindhoven, that was the third bridge, Eindhoven. So the operation launches on September 17th, 1944. September 17th, 1944, which also happens to be Constitution Day, and September 17th also happens to be the single bloodiest day in American history, the Battle of Antietam, or Sharpsburg, depending on which side you like in that war. Yes, September 17th, the single bloodiest day. So we launched this on September 17th, 1944. Initially, it is met with success. The 82nd Airborne takes Nijmegen. The 101st Airborne takes Eindhoven. And they take some other Dutch cities here as well. The 30th Corps is able to push through and initially get through the German defensive lines and start pushing northward. However, the key bridge, the main one we really need to take here, is the one at Arnhem. Now, what happens at Arnhem is a tragedy. It just so happened that those reports of a bigger German presence there were accurate. The Germans had a crack SS Panzer Division in Arnhem. But they've got all these crack SS units. They've been stationed there to rest and refit. They've been in the line. Now they're taken out of the line. They're resting. They're refitting there. And it just so happened that just a few weeks earlier, these units had taken part in exercises of how to deal with an Allied parachute drop. They had just completed training on how to deal with it, okay? So this is really bad news for the British 1st Paratrooper Division, Airborne Division. So when the British land, they take a part of the bridge, and very quickly the Germans start pouncing on them. And again, an airborne division does not drop with heavy equipment, and here you are up against a Panzer division that's coming right at him here. So after several days of fighting, in which it was obvious that by this point Horrocks gets to the first two bridges, Eindhoven and Nijmegen, but they just can't press forward to Arnhem. In fact, the problem was they wouldn't push forward. Their infantry was caught up kind of in mopping up operations, and they had the tanks, but the tanks refused to push forward without their infantry. Had they done that, who knows, maybe things would have been different. The Germans are able to force the British paratroopers to surrender. They take about 6,000 men casualties. About half of those 6,000 men were wounded. Operation Market Garden, then, ultimately is a fiasco. It does not achieve its objectives. The Allies lost total about 15,000 casualties, and the German casualties were probably comparable. We don't know exactly what they were, but they're probably comparable to that. There's a great film from the 1970s called A Bridge Too Far, and everybody who's anybody that was an actor at the time, Sean Connery, Anthony Hopkins, Gene Hackman, Robert Redford, James Caan, all these stars are in it. It's a really good film. It's a really good depiction of the battle here. They drop their paratroopers, but they have to drop it quite a ways away from the thing, because when they're bringing the cargo planes to drop them, the RAF was very concerned that if they get too close to the city, the German flak could take them down. Because when you're dropping paratroopers, they're not incredibly high, right? Okay. So they're scared they'd be taken down by AA guns. So they have to drop them off a ways away. What happens is when they drop them off, the section that lands closest to the bridge starts moving on the bridge, and they take like a part of the bridge head. And I don't think they ever take the length of the bridge. And then what happened was Roy Urquhart here, who's the commander, he gets kind of goes into town, and he gets separated from his guys, and literally he's like hiding in buildings from German patrols the whole time. So the division commander is not even really exercising command, and a lot of the guys get trapped, and they start trying to drop supplies in on them, but they're landing further away. They're landing in the German lines, and it was really quite a fiasco. And they thought the intelligence that told them that the Germans were there, they kind of ignored, or they kind of downplayed, and they acted like, well, maybe there may be a few Germans there, but we can overcome it. And they kind of ignored the fact that they shouldn't have done it given the intelligence they had, and so they just talked themselves out of it. It's kind of like the CIA during the Bay of Pigs operation. They knew they shouldn't do that. They knew it wasn't going to work, but they talked themselves into it. So, again, mission creep. Well, like I say, in World War II, I think I don't know that they really fundamentally. The only time in World War II where I think you can point to paratroopers, well, I guess there's two times you can point to paratroopers being really effective. And the first one was just for like commando raids, and I'm thinking of like the Aban-Amel raid by the Germans at the beginning of the war that takes Aban-Amel in Belgium. But the only time you see like a massive parachute drop that really achieves its objective was Crete, and even then the Germans took tremendous casualties. Whenever the Allies drop paratroopers, they never work as promised. It never works as promised. So I'm quite critical of paratroopers. And don't get me wrong, I have nothing but the highest respect for the paratroopers themselves. No, I'm serious. I think they did great jobs. I think hell, you look at like Band of Brothers, see what Dick Winters did on D-Day. It was pretty impressive. But I mean, just as an operational concept, I have a lot of problems with the use of paratroopers in World War II. For commando raids and stuff, that's fine. But when we're talking about major operations, again, you look at all the resources you pour in to create an airborne division. They could have been better used in other areas, in my opinion. Okay, so now we've penetrated up here pretty far, and we start to settle in then we have a few little operations to go. And incidentally, clearing the Scheldt, when we actually cleared the Scheldt there, that's a pretty epic story too, but I'm not going to get into it too much. There's a great film that just came out on Netflix last year called The Last Battle, or The Forgotten Battle, and it's all about the Battle of Scheldt. It's highly worth watching too. Okay, so as we start approaching winter, both sides kind of appear to settle down and hunker down for the winter. Now, usually, all things being equal, armies don't fight in winter. Now, occasionally they do. George Washington famously took Trenton on Christmas Day. Nobody had ever fought on Christmas Day before George Washington, and then George Washington launches the Christmas Day attack, and suddenly everybody's doing it for a while. But usually during winter, armies hunker down. And as the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest is winding down, it's getting colder, the temperatures are dropping, things are winding down. Now, Courtney Hodges here, he's just pissed away a lot of men in the Hurtgen. And he kind of has a breakdown. He kind of has something of a breakdown. And some people suggested he was just sick. He just caught, a cold or something, or the flu. Montgomery went to visit him with his intelligence officer, and his intelligence officer wrote book, and he kind of says the guy just lost it. He'd lost his nerve here. In any case, whatever, if it was the strain of battle or physical illness, First Army headquarters is a mess. It's not working at the end of the battle. It's just clearly Courtney Hodges lost control here. Montgomery, also, as this is happening too, Montgomery notices something. So Bradley, here's the 12th Army Group here, and he is commanding Patton and then Simpson and Hodges there, okay? But he's noticing that Bradley's headquarters is pretty close to Patton here, but as you can see, Hodges and Simpson's, they're pretty far north, and Eisenhower at Schaeff is telling Bradley, you need to more tightly control these units. You need to bring these units closer together. You need to move in closer here to exercise better control. And Bradley just kind of ignores it. Bradley's like, oh, it's fine. It's fine. He is controlling. I didn't mention now, William Simpson here is commanding an army as well, the 9th Army. So Eisenhower's scared that kind of a gap is developing in our line. And Bradley doesn't really take steps to change that. But no one of the reasons why he's not concerned is we have no intelligence indications whatsoever that the Germans are up to anything. Okay? In our mind, they have settled down. They've settled down for the winter. So Bradley just leaves this gap where it is. However, Hitler had actually been husbanding his resources for one great final push against the Allies. Now, many of his officers kind of question why he's attempting to throw this big, massive assault against the Western Allies when the Russians are barreling in from the east toward Berlin. But the fact of the matter is, if he'd launched a major attack against the Soviets, the scale of this attack would be nothing like Barbarossa or Case Blue. It would be a much smaller affair. And that front is so wide that if he were to attack somewhere, that attack would just be overwhelmed by the Russians. It wouldn't count for anything. But he believes he can launch an assault here that will count for something. Hitler's plan is to launch an attack through here. Again, this is the Ardennes Forest where they came through in 1940, right? Same place. Come through here, take Antwerp, take Brussels and take Antwerp, and capture the American supplies along the way. So this is Hitler's plan, right? He believes his ultimate plan is this. If he can cut the Americans off from the British, he believed that the Western Allies would then make peace with him and that he could turn his armies around to fight the Russians. That's his plan. Now, here's the thing about Hitler. Hitler, I really believe initially, was a pretty good strategic thinker. In fact, much better than many of his generals, I think. I don't think he gets enough credit for that because he's an asshole and we hate him. But I think he really was a good strategic thinker at the beginning of the war. And he's asking questions a lot of his subordinates weren't. But after Stalingrad, that goes out the window. Increasingly, after Stalingrad, Hitler's strategic calculations are based entirely on wishful thinking. They're based on wishful thinking. Yeah, it was a mixture of a bunch of things, including cocaine and pulverized bull's testicles. And he was injecting himself with this stuff regularly. Hermann Goering was constantly taking stuff. And one thing, too, about Hitler, we don't know for sure, but we believe here these last few months of the war, he was actually suffering from early stages of Parkinson's. And so we think he had Parkinson's disease. Again, because Hitler has always been a gambler, right? Hitler has always been a gambler. And this is another gamble. This is another time he's gonna roll the dice and see if it works for him. It worked for him in 1940, right? So he's thinking it might work for him here. The Germans will use three panzer armies consisting of 32 divisions. 32 divisions. Within that 32 divisions, it's about 1,000 tanks and somewhere between 200 and 250,000 troops. 1,000 tanks, 200 and 250,000 troops. So again, the ultimate objective is reaching Antwerp, Belgium. This is the overall commander here is Gerhard von Rundstedt once again. Von Rundstedt, we know, was the CNC commander west during D-Day. He was relieved, replaced with Model, and then later Rundstedt comes back here. Walter Model actually has is kind of beneath him. He has the operational command, but then von Rundstedt is kind of the ultimate commander here in the west. The Germans achieve total surprise. They unleash this on December 16, and they have total operational surprise. Now, one of the big reasons why they're going when they're going is it's literally in the middle of snowstorms. It's denying the Allies air cover. So it's completely negating the Allied advantage in air cover. The Germans attack through the Ardennes forest, as I mentioned, and Hitler famously said before the battle, "We have far fewer tanks, but our tanks are better." And in some sense, he wasn't wrong. The Sherman, if a Sherman like a Tiger are just shooting at each other, Tiger's going to win. The Sherman, in order to take out a Tiger, has to maneuver around it or behind it, right? So in that sense, but the thing of it is, too, a Sherman is more maneuverable than a Tiger because the Tiger is much bigger, much heavier, right? Well, the Germans make significant gains throughout this battle. They make significant gains throughout the battle, pushing in there. This is the Battle of the Bulge, or the Ardennes offensive here. And they trap the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne. The 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne. Now, Bastogne is one of those places where the roads come together. And you kind of need this for your supply lines. So the Germans have to invest a lot of their guys surrounding Bastogne, and they're pounding the hell out of it. One thing that they're doing here, it's one thing they did in the Hurtgen Forest, is they would shoot their artillery, and it would actually go off, not when it hit the ground, but it would go off above the ground in the trees. So it just hits like the branches of the trees, and it goes up there, and it turns all of the trees into giant splinters, and just it magnifies the blast that it otherwise would have. So they surround the 101st Airborne Division of Bastogne. The commander of the 101st Airborne Division was Maxwell Taylor, but because everything had settled down for the winter, he was back in Washington, D.C. giving testimony before Congress. And so his second-in-command was named McAuliffe. And McAuliffe, the Germans give him a surrender request. They say, in the name of humanity, please spare your troops and surrender. And of course, what was McAuliffe? What was his one-word response? Nuts, nuts, which is a polite way of saying "F you," right? But so he says nuts, and they continue to hold their position. Well, these are incredibly desperate days. Okay, these days, we were just taken completely off guard, the Americans and the British here. And I should point out, it's not helping that Hodges' command was falling apart. Montgomery actually went to his headquarters, and Montgomery actually whips that headquarters back into shape, right? But what happens is, in order to determine what to do here, they meet, Eisenhower and a lot of his commanders meet at Verdun, okay? They meet at Verdun, which you may remember, Verdun was the site of the largest battle of World War I. They meet at Verdun to discuss what is happening. And while they're there, Eisenhower says, these Germans have cut between Bradley, his headquarters, and the 9th and 1st Armies. So he essentially puts the American 1st and 9th Armies under command of Montgomery, at least temporarily. Okay, Bradley wasn't too happy about that. It's kind of a reproach to Bradley, but he let the Germans through there. So Montgomery, like I say, goes to Hodges' HQ. He sorts everything out. He gets it working, and they're able to kind of put up a defense here against the Germans. Now further south here was Patton and Patton's Third Army. So you got, I think it's Bastogne right here, where they're being holding things up. Patton comes up from the north, and he attacks the Germans from the south. And Patton was already in battle. He disengages from a battle. He actually said that at Verdun, they say, Patton, how soon can you get your forces there? Now, conventional wisdom would say about a week. And he says, I can do it in 2 days. And they laugh at him, and they say, Patton, you can't do it in 2 days. He says, yeah, I'll do it in 2 days. And Patton does it in 2 days. He's attacking the German positions here within 2 days. And It's because his troops are more scared of him than they are of the Germans, right? And fortunately, too, just as Patton is beginning to attack, he actually said to his chaplain, I want you to prepare a prayer for me to give, to pray for good weather for this battle. And the chaplain says, I don't know how good I would feel about preparing a prayer so that we can kill our fellow man. And Patton says, you give me that prayer or I'll court-martial you. So he writes him the prayer. He gives the prayer. And the next day, the skies begin to clear. So if you're a believer, there you go. There's your evidence. But the sky begins to clear, and air power now can be used effectively to halt this German advance. And that's exactly what happens. They blunt the advance of the Germans here. And Patton gets up to relieve the 101st Airborne. However, never, ever, 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 ever say to a member of the 101st Airborne, you were relieved by Patton at Bastogne. They don't like being told that. The 101st Airborne always says, we didn't need relieving. We were doing fine. Okay. I was at that conference at the National World War II Museum in February, and I said, just kind of offhandedly, I said, when Patton relieved the 101st Airborne, one of the other scholars there came up and he pointed to his lapel and he had 101st Airborne pin. He says, we didn't need relieving. So just going to spare you a little grief in the future, because that, of course, eventually will come up for all of you. Now, throughout the battle of the Bulge, we start to have some really disturbing things happen, because most of these units that are participating in the Battle of the Bulge, including SAS units, these were soldiers that had fought on the Eastern Front against the Russians. And it was a very different war on the Eastern Front. It was a far more brutal war on the Eastern Front, as we've talked about, right? And now they're fighting the Americans. So what they do is, these Germans, when the Germans begin here to fight against the Americans, these battle-hardened Eastern Front troops, when they come in, they actually engage in a series of massacres. After a brief engagement on 17 December near Normandy, Belgium, elements of the U.S. 7th Armored Division surrendered to SS units. The SS promptly marches them into a field and executes them. It is illegal in war when someone holds up their hands to kill them. It's murder, okay? It's murder. And these men were murdered. At least 84 Americans were shot and killed while prisoners here. The same day, we have another massacre occurs near Wereth, Belgium. 11 African-American soldiers surrendered to the SS. The SS tortured and then shot these African-American soldiers there. In order to make examples of civilians who had aided the Americans or aided the Allies, the SS, because remember, the SS was holding this, the Americans came in, and now the SS is coming back. They are torturing, murdering, destroying villages, committing various atrocities throughout Belgium here against civilians. I read one account that said when the American soldiers, after the battle, when they liberated some of this area from the Nazis, they found just some of the things just absolutely heartbreaking. They talked about, like, in one case, they found a 5-year-old boy who was nailed to a barn. Just absolutely disturbing things that these Germans are doing here to the Belgian civilians. Well, and it's not just them. On New Year's Day, 1945, in response for what happened at Normandy, American soldiers murder 60 German prisoners near a town called Chinon. Okay? So Americans, they also did it. There was also in Sicily, there were some instances of Americans murdering Germans in Sicily too. So war crimes happen, right? And we can talk about the greater or lesser extent, but I mean, it happens. But critically here, the German assault is blunted, right? So this is where they wanted to get, was up here, and this is as far as they got, okay? There's Bastogne there. So as you can see, they just, and really fundamentally, one of the big things that stops the Germans is they run out of gas. Their whole attack was predicated on the fact that they were going to liberate stores of gasoline and fuel and ammunition from the Allies, and they never get as much as they intended to get there. Now, what will happen is the battle will continue for 3 more weeks, where the Allies will actually start pushing the Germans back into Germany. Okay, So that's the battle continues, but it's really this like first week or so of the battle that is kind of that critical period where it looks like we could lose everything. Okay. Now, what is significant here about the Battle of the Bulge is this is the last major German offensive of the war. Now, you'll have a few other local offensives that will happen. There'll be one that will be kind of decent near I think, Budapest in a few months. But really, this is the last major offensive of the war. And the Allies will suffer approximately 75,000 casualties. The Allies will suffer 75,000 casualties. The Germans will suffer about 120,000 casualties. 120,000 casualties. Now remember, the Germans start this with about 200 to 250,000. They lose about 120,000 casualties. So you're looking at approximately half their strength is in or become casualties. 50% casualty rate here. And of course, by this time of the war, the Germans simply cannot afford to take these kinds of losses, especially in material and equipment. They just can't replace these losses. Okay, and I think maybe I mentioned this to you earlier in the semester, but there was a kind of a story that details that in I think not long after D-Day there was a German anti-tank gunner. Did I tell you this story about the anti-tank gunner in Germany? And whenever the Americans would send a tank up over the ridge, he'd shoot it and he'd take it down. He's always burning American tanks, and he's shooting them. Finally, eventually, the Americans take this guy prisoner, and this guy says to the Americans, "You American, you're not good soldiers. You don't know the first thing about fighting. You don't know how to fight a war." He's just trash-talking them, and the interrogators say, "Oh, well, if we're so bad, then how come you're our prisoner?" And he says, "Because I ran out of ammunition before you ran out of tanks." All right, now as all of this is going on here on the battlefield here, we have the final meeting of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin in Yalta. Yalta is in the Crimea. Originally, they were going to meet in Malta in the Mediterranean, but Stalin didn't want to go there. So Churchill said, "From Malta to Yalta, may our plans never alter." So they go to Yalta, and essentially, Yalta had just recently been liberated by the Red Army a few months earlier. So it's still in shambles. So essentially, the Soviets are doing everything they can to make this place livable. To make it a decent place here. Well, they meet here at Yalta, and Stalin's, of course, priority here is to force the other Allied nations to kind of recognize Soviet domination of Eastern Europe after the war and the Balkans. Now, once again, Roosevelt doesn't want to meet alone with Churchill because he doesn't want to look like they're ganging up on Stalin. Roosevelt kind of, Stalin pulls all this crap during the war, and not once does the United States ever use Lend-Lease as leverage. At any time, we could have said, "Hey, you do this, or maybe suddenly you're not going to get as many tanks and trucks." And Roosevelt never does that because he naively believes if we can just show Stalin that we're treating with him squarely, he'll treat us squarely. And he just completely misread Stalin. And the fact that the United States and the Allies do not use Lend-Lease as a major lever against Soviet ambitions here is astounding. Now, you could argue, well, the Soviets have the ultimate trump. They could have made a separate peace with Germany, but by that point, that wasn't going to happen. So anyway, the conference began on 4th February, and Roosevelt chaired this conference. Stalin insisted that Roosevelt chair the conference. And over the next few days, the leaders discussed military strategy as well as the treatment of Germans after the war and Germany after the war. On February 6th, they discussed Roosevelt's pet project. And Roosevelt's pet project was something called the United Nations. Now, they were already referring to themselves as the United Nations in the war. We are the United Nations in the war. But Roosevelt wanted to preserve the wartime alliance after the war, and he wanted to do this through an institution called the United Nations, which would be modeled on the League of Nations, but would have, in some ways, more power than the League of Nations would have. And critically, the big difference would be the United States never joined the League of Nations, but the United States would be in a key part of the United Nations. Now, one of the key issues, too, that they're discussing here is Poland. I don't have it there. Okay. One of the key issues they're discussing here is Poland. The country, by this point, had been virtually overrun by the Red Army, and the communists see no reason to cede anything. Churchill lamented, quote, "The Americans are profoundly ignorant of the Polish problem." Now remember, England, in September of 1939, went to war with Germany because of Poland, because the Germans had taken over Poland. And now, we're just going to let Poland go to the communists? Churchill is very upset about that. Stalin says, big chunks of eastern Poland should be detached from Poland and given to Ukraine and Belarus, and then Poland should be compensated by giving land in the west, which would be at Germany's expense after the war. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we touched upon this last time, Stalin has his own group of Polish communists. He wants to create a government. They were from Lublin, the Lublin region of Poland, which was the first town that was liberated. And so they call these the Lublin Poles. So you have the government in exile in London, the Polish democratically elected government in exile in Poland, in London. And then you have the Lublin Poles, which are communists. Okay, the Soviets are there, so they're going to be able to install the Lublin Poles and call them a legitimate government here. Stalin, for a time, said, well, we could potentially have these two governments running things side by side. But he says the Lublin Poles are already there, they're already acting as a provisional government, and I support them. So Stalin, he makes these promises for a free and independent Poland and free elections, but his word means little. And of course the Soviets will dominate Poland throughout the Cold War, right, until the end of the 1980s. One other key thing they're discussing here at this conference is, when will the Soviet Union declare war on Japan? Because remember, the Soviets and the Japanese were not fighting. The Soviets and the Japanese had fought briefly at Khalkhin Gol in the summer of 1939, and then in 1941, just a few months before Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, Stalin and the Japanese had signed a non-aggression pact. They had honored that non-aggression pact. The Soviets and the Japanese had honored that non-aggression pact. But when will they come in? Well, the Soviets said, well, we'll go in, but of course we'll need territorial compensation in Asia. Well, of course, heaven forbid they just do a good deed, right? Roosevelt agreed to these ideas in principle. Chiang Kai-shek, who of course was the Chinese leader, he wouldn't have approved. He wouldn't have been too happy about this, but he wasn't there. The Allies also discussed the idea of repatriation of POWs. Now remember, many Soviet citizens became those Ost battalions. They served the Germans. And not just in the front lines. Many of the guards in the concentration camps and the death camps were Ukrainians and other Soviet citizens. At Auschwitz, there was, of course, all the prisoners would go to the showers naked, in the concentration camp, in the death camps. And frequently, Ukrainian guards would single out women, rape them, and then just throw them back in line to be killed. So this kind of stuff happened. Well, the question is, will these people who served the Germans, not just on those death camps, but in the Ost battalions, many of whom didn't have a choice, they would be repatriated back to the Soviets. Now, Stalin is not going to be too pleased with these people, as you can imagine, right? It's a death sentence. But, the position of the Allies are, well, these people we're fighting for the Germans, so they agree to that. Well, this is kind of where they, too, divide up occupation zones in Germany after the war, which they think will last 2 or 3 years. They end up lasting 40, But what they do is they say the Soviets will enter the war against Japan 6 months after the fall of Germany. That was their promise. Okay, in the East here, we have now at the beginning of 1945 kind of a race to Moscow. Stalin has his two most dynamic commanders by this point, Georgy Zhukov, who commands the 1st Belarusian Front, and Ivan Konev, who commands the 1st Ukrainian Front. Stalin knows that both of these men are incredibly ambitious, and they both want to take Berlin, so he essentially says, well, okay, whoever takes it first, takes it first. He's essentially having them compete against each other for the honor of taking Berlin, playing them off against each other. So as the Red Army, it enters Poland. The Red Army enters Poland. It obviously has to go through Poland. And as it presses into Poland, it starts to discover some pretty disturbing things, and that is the death camps. Okay, the Soviets liberate the death camps. Now, this is important too because when the Americans go into Germany, will liberate kind of regular German concentration camps. A lot of people die in German concentration camps from malnutrition. Sometimes they're beaten. Sometimes they're outright murdered. They're worked to death. There's a lot of reasons why people die in concentration camps. But people do not go to the regular concentration camps to be killed. The death camps in Poland are factory murder systems. In fact, most Americans will not understand the extent of the Holocaust until 1962 when the Adolf Eichmann trial is televised. And that's when most Americans realize just how big the Holocaust truly was. But it is the Soviets that liberate these camps. I read one account of the Soviets. I think they were going into Auschwitz. And these Soviet soldiers were just appalled at what they saw. I mean, how could you not be? They're just appalled seeing all these corpses. And they feel so bad. These people are like walking skeletons. So what do the Soviets do? Well, let's feed them. So they go and they make these like stews and stuff to feed these people. Well, of course, you can't just eat heavy stuff when you're starving to death. And so all these people die that they're trying to save because they don't know any better, right? These soldiers, Red Army soldiers, don't know any better. I read a book one time years ago about this guy who he was an American bomber pilot, and at the end of the war, as the Soviets are approaching, he was a prisoner of war of the Germans. The Soviets are approaching from the east. They actually march him west, and he's able eventually to escape. And he hadn't eaten for like weeks, and they put him in this hospital. And of course, they're trying to just give him a measured way to bring him back. And they tell him, they say, like, half your stomach's gone, it's eaten itself. Said, you'll probably live for about another 4 or 5 years. He went on to live like another, 40 or 50 years. But anyway, he's in this hospital in Belgium, and he's with these other guys that were recovering too. And after they're there for about a month or so, they're still on the mend, right? But they're bored to death. Like every day they're in this thing, and they're bored to death. And they're pleading with the doctor, let us go into town. Please let us go into town. And the doctor finally relents, and he says, okay, here's what I'll do. I'll let you go into town, but you've got to promise me you will not eat anything. You will not eat anything, and under no circumstances can you have alcohol. Under no circumstances can you have alcohol. And they say, yeah, we're fine. Well, this guy, the guy that wrote the book was a Mormon, so he didn't drink. And they were going into town, and as soon as they get off the train or whatever, a couple of these guys say, there's a bar, let's go get some beers. And this guy and his friends who aren't drinking, they're running after him, you can't do it. He says, we're fine. He said they drank these beers, and literally right in front of them, they coughed up their stomachs, and they died. Well, so these Red Army soldiers, they go ahead and they liberate these camps here. Over 500,000 Jews served in the Red Army over the course of the war. Over 500,000 Jews served in the Red Army. And for them, this kind of evidence of German mass murder of Jews, it resonates powerfully. And you have many integrated Soviet Jews, right, who would they weren't religious. They were secular Soviet communist Jews. But there was still this kind of cultural, most of them still spoke Yiddish. And one of the things this does is it makes Jews in the Soviet Union kind of more aware of their Jewishness. And many Jews kind of rediscover their Jewishness as a result of seeing the horrors that are visited here. And that's going to cause tension in the years after the war between many of the Jewish people in the Soviet Union and the Soviet leaders here as well. Now, the Red Army itself is far less interested in the plight of the Jews as much as using these camps as kind of propaganda evidence against fascism and against Nazism, right? So the Red Army, that's what they're doing. Of course, they're publicizing what they're finding as much as they can. They were aware that these death camps were going on. They could have launched offensives toward the death camps sooner, but it's kind of not a priority for the Soviet leaders, right? And again, they're thinking we want to win the war, and everything else is kind of subordinate to that. And that's not terribly dissimilar from the position of, again, the Americans who are urged to bomb the camps. And Roosevelt would say, no, the best thing we can do is win the war. Use our military resources to win the war as quick as we can, right? Now, Zhukov, as his front advances through Poland and East Prussia here, they soon meet stiff resistance here before they enter the city at a place called Silo Heights, right here before they can get into the city. So I got here, you have the Battle of Silo Heights. And this is kind of the last great geographic barrier before Berlin. You have some hills, some elevated terrain there, and the Germans are holding it. This battle really occurs in earnest here, as you can see, from the 16th to the 19th of April, 1945. And Zhukov, as he's held up here, he's terrified that Konev will be able to sneak around him from the south and push toward Berlin while he's occupied here at the heights. During this battle, the Silo Heights, the Germans lose around 30,000 men, the Soviets about 12,000 men. Before this happens, a couple months, go back to February, about the same time of the Yalta Conference, we also have the firebombing of Dresden. Now, we talked about the firebombing of Hamburg in July of 43. So this is the same thing here, but the firebombing of Hamburg was a British operation primarily. Americans took part in it, but it was primarily a British operation. This is primarily an American operation. We completely destroy the city of Dresden. And this is right in front of where the Russians are going to advance. So it's been argued the reason this was authorized was because we wanted to send the Russians a message. We can do this. We did this to the Germans. We can do it to you if you don't behave, right? Whether or not that's the case, who knows? Some people suggested there was absolutely no military necessity for bombing this city. In fact, it was a big transportation hub. There's a big church in Dresden called the Frauenkirche, Our Lady, which is the Protestant church, but it's called Our Lady. It's kind of weird. After this bombing was done, it was still standing for like a day or two, and then it just collapsed. When the Soviets come in, for the next 40, 50 years, that's just fenced off. They literally fence off the rubble. And that rubble just sits there for the entirety of the life of the state of East Germany. It just stays. Communists have no desire to rebuild a church, right? As soon as the Berlin Wall fell, they start to go to work to rebuild this church. And what they do is they literally would take every brick and every piece of rubble and they computer scanned it. And then they found what they could still use and what they couldn't. And so they shaped new blocks to fit the old blocks. And so this building now, it's like this combination of this lighter, newer stone and this darker, older stone. And it's amazing to see how much you can see what is the original church and what's not. But each section of those stones is in the exact same place it was before it collapsed. It's really remarkable. Now we also have, in the West, the U.S. First Army is able to capture a bridge at Regemund. This is the Ludendorff Bridge, named for Erich von Ludendorff, one of the generals in World War I. But they capture this bridge intact here in March. And then it's intact. They're able to get the United States, a lot of elements of the First Army across. And then about 3 or 4 days later, the bridge collapses. The Germans had tried to demolish it. They couldn't. But it ends up collapsing. But we've got a sizable army on the other side. And so we can create bridges by that point. It's hard to try to get to the other side when people are shooting at you. But if you control the other bank, then you're okay, right? The British, Americans, French now essentially held a significant portion of Western Germany, and they start pushing forward in there. By April 25th, so you can see here, by April 25th, these Allied armies are taking virtually all of Germany. Here's a picture of an American and a Soviet soldier at Torgau. The Americans and the Soviets meet at Torgau and shake hands, embrace each other, and very, very important moment. There's a great picture I was trying to find. I couldn't find it. They're on Torgau, and there's like 3 Americans and 3 Soviets, and they're like shaking their hands over the river. It's really cool. They're over a creek or something by the river, but it was really cool. Now, as they're moving in there closer, the Germans are getting far more desperate here. Now, Martin Bormann, and I don't think I have Martin Bormann up here. I should probably. Martin Bormann is essentially Hitler's secretary. This is the guy that literally knows where all the bodies are buried. Hitler was, at the time of World War II, Hitler was arguably the wealthiest man in Europe, personally wealthy. From a lot of different, he owned a lot of different things, and he had a lot of different concerns. This guy, he essentially manages his money, so he knows where all of Hitler's money is, and he pretty much controls access to the Fuhrer. By the end of the war, you have to. I don't think we discussed Rudolf Hess's flight here. Rudolf Hess was Hitler's number 3, and he left Germany in 1941 on a peace mission that he didn't tell anybody about. Anyway, he gets captured by the British. Martin Bormann becomes then kind of the head of the party, and he is Hitler's kind of, as I say, de facto secretary. Well, Bormann and Himmler, and Heinrich Himmler, they create a national militia here in late 1944 that would be answerable to the party, not the military, but the party. And the name of this is the Volkssturm, which means People's Storm, People's Storm. Himmler stated that, quote, if the enemy should break in somewhere, he will encounter such a fanatical people, fighting like mad to the end, that he will certainly not get through. In fact, this militia is made up of, as you can see, women and old men learning how to use Panzerfausts. I mean, this woman was probably a housewife. The most machinery she'd ever used before would be like a mixer or something like that, and now she's using an anti-tank weapon, right? Essentially, 16 through 60-year-olds are called up for their service in the Volkssturm. 16 through 16. Of course, most of your men are not there. They're at the front. So this is primarily children, women, and old men that are drafted into the thing here. The operational command of the Volkssturm is placed under the Gauleiter. Remember, the Gauleiter is a district party leader. So again, not the military, but the party is commanding them. The head of the replacement army, we talked about that was Friedrich Fromm. You remember, he's the guy that executed Stauffenberg, and then he himself will later be shot for his part in the 20th of July plot. Friedrich Fromm kind of had a de facto operational control because the Gauleiter, of course, they're not military men, they're politicians, right? So Friedrich Fromm, the head of the replacement army, when this is created, he has kind of de facto control. In theory, they're controlled by the Gauleiter, but Fromm is actually the guy pulling the strings here. And Bormann himself, then, you could probably say Bormann is the ultimate commander of the Volkssturm, because he's essentially, if he ever wants to do anything, and anybody else checks him to say it's not a good idea, he can go to Hitler, talk Hitler into it, and Hitler will give him his way. So that proximity to Hitler. And Hitler, one thing about Hitler, too, is Hitler, very often, he kind of suffers from a real negative trait of, he kind of tends to agree with the last person he talked to. You know, there's a lot of that goes on with Hitler here. Well, as you can imagine, the contributions of the Volkssturm in this struggle are very little aside from just getting the people that are in it killed. The Volkssturm will actually see heavy action beginning in early 1945 in East Prussia, and usually they would just wear civilian clothes and green armbands. They'd have a green armband, that was their uniform, right? But they're lightly armed, they're poorly trained, they're badly led. This is really the last act of desperation, but it kind of fits in with this German fantasy that it is the German people that will rise up and save the homeland. You know, it's real operatic stuff. And there's a phrase in German, Gotterdammerung, which means Twilight of the Gods. It's the name of one of Wagner's operas, and Hitler loved Wagner. And this destruction of Germany we're going to see here at the end, I mean, Hitler's essentially stage managing his own version of the Twilight of the Gods right here at the end of the war, right? In fact, there was a great novel that came out in the 60s, and I can't remember that. Otto Basel was the author, and he was an Austrian. He was a literary and drama critic in the 1960s in Austria. But as a young man, he'd served in the Wehrmacht during World War II, and he wrote this novel called The Twilight Men. And the novel it's an alternate history. It's like what if the Nazis had won the war, and it's about essentially then the Germans and the Japanese would engage in this nuclear war with each other. But it's very literary, and it's very well written. It's in German. It's a translation, but it's very good, and it plays on those themes of Wagner and the Twilight of the Gods. It's very well. That's why it's called the Twilight Men. When the Twilight of the Gods commences, the Twilight Men appear. But anyway, okay. So we can see the approach here of the Belarusian armies and the Ukrainian armies, and they're surrounding Berlin. And on April 20th, Hitler's in his bunker. On April 12th, Hitler's in his bunker, and he gets some news that completely lifts his spirits, that thinks everything might be turned around. And that is, there's news over the radio that Franklin Roosevelt has died. Now, Hitler took with him around Europe, wherever he went to his headquarters, he had this giant framed painting of Frederick the Great he would take with him. Now, Frederick the Great was considered the greatest German soldier king of all time, right? It's just he was a brilliant general. Very interesting guy in his own right. But during the 7 Years' War, And what's the 7 Years' War here in America? What do we call it here in America? French and Indian War. French and Indian War. Well, during the 7 Years' War, the reason Frederick had such a big army is that the British were paying for it. The British were subsidizing it, right? Well, there gets to a point where he's racing back and forth. He's fighting the French, he's fighting the Russians, he's fighting the Swedes, he's fighting the Austrians. He's going all around, putting out all these fires, and finally he's up against the Russians, and he's on his last leg, and defeat for Frederick the Great is imminent. It is imminent. And then the Tsarina dies. And her heir was like a nephew, I can't remember, was Peter, and Peter gets up there, and or Paul, I can't remember, the next Tsar. He gets up there and he says famously, he was a great admirer of the Prussians and of Frederick. And he said, I would rather be a lowly private in the Prussian army than the field marshal in the Russian army. And so he immediately calls off the war. So it was Providence, right? And Hitler, they always talk about Providence. And Goebbels is talking this up. And Hitler thought then, too, history was going to repeat itself. Franklin Roosevelt, the greatest war criminal of all time, Hitler would call him, had died. And they don't know anything about Truman. They know the name Harry Truman, but they don't know anything about him. They're thinking, well, Truman obviously is going to call an end to the war, and maybe he'll even join us in fighting the Russians. And again, this is Hitler's just total divorce from reality here. Okay? By this point, it doesn't make any sense. After a day or two of high spirits, it becomes very obvious Harry Truman has no plans to seek a ceasefire or anything. So he was very upset. And then on April 20th, by this point, April 20th, Berlin is almost completely surrounded. And on April 20th happens to be, of course, Hitler's 56th birthday party. And they have this kind of macabre celebration in the party chancellery. And by this point, Hitler's living in the bunker underneath the chancellery. He'd moved in there in January of 1945. And all the leading Nazis come to pay their respects, and they're all looking at their watches because they want to get out of Berlin before it's too late. They want to get out of Berlin before it's too late. Scrambling to get out of the city like rats there, right? They're ordered to leave, but they can't get out soon enough because they know what's coming. They know the Russians are coming, and they know the Russians are not going to be very kind toward them. So Hitler, he's in the bunker these last few days. He's trying to defend the city with imaginary units, ordering counterattacks and stuff that just never materialize. They're just not realistic. And then he finds out, and initially they get a letter, or they get a telegram from Goering, who is in the south of Germany, and he sends this letter saying, if I have not heard from you by 10 o'clock, do you agree that you've lost? I'll take it for granted that you've lost your freedom of action. So, do you agree that, in line with the line of succession established in September 1939, that I will become the new Führer? Now, of course, Goering is simply just trying to make sure there's continuity of government if Hitler is cut off in Berlin. But Bormann intercepts this, and he goes to Hitler and says, "Look, it's a coup. He's trying to take over the government." So Hitler actually feels betrayed by Goering, who was one of his oldest comrades. He orders him expelled from the party, and then, unbeknownst to Hitler, almost certainly unbeknownst to Hitler, Bormann ordered that he be executed. So Goering, right here at the end of the war, is just trying to hold on. And then a few days later, Heinrich Himmler, the BBC that they're listening to, sends a broadcast saying that Heinrich Himmler is actually working with the International Red Cross to work out some kind of a deal. And he started, as a gesture of goodwill, he'd released a number of Jewish concentration camp prisoners to the Red Cross in exchange for some kind of an armistice that they could work out there, which, of course, the Red Cross was in touch with the West, and he was hoping they would kind of broker some kind of a deal. Himmler was convinced that sooner or later, with Hitler was dead, he would be the only one that could maintain order in Germany, and that Eisenhower would be calling him up and telling him, "You need to come work for us," right? Again, wishful thinking on Himmler's part here as well. But Hitler feels betrayed by Himmler as well. So Hitler feels like his two of his chief guys have betrayed him. Joseph Goebbels actually goes to live in the bunker with Hitler. He brings his wife and 6 children into the bunker with him. Hitler refuses to leave the capital. As you see in that thing, they're trying to talk him into leaving. He refuses to leave the capital. He will not leave. So finally, on April 29th, he marries Eva Braun, his longtime girlfriend, and the next day they both commit suicide. She actually signed the wedding certificate, Eva Bra, and then she crosses off the BR and writes Hitler. They kill themselves. Hitler swallows poison, and they both swallow cyanide, and at the same time that he bites down the cyanide, he blows his own brains out. Joseph Goebbels is actually named the new Reich's chancellor in Hitler's political testament. That lasts for about a day. He marched... the night that Hitler killed himself, the Magda Goebbels, who was kind of the unofficial first lady of the Third Reich, Joseph Goebbels' wife, she was very close with Hitler, and she was devastated that when Hitler killed himself, and she said, I don't want my children growing up in a world without Hitler, so they poisoned their 6 children while they sleep. They give them a chocolate that had a sedative in it while they were asleep. Hitler's Dr. Morell injects them all with a euthanizes them, essentially. After all these 6 children are killed, the Joseph and Magda Goebbels walk outside. He shoots her in the head, then he shoots himself in the head. So in its wake, we have the Flensburg government. The Flensburg government. Now, before his death, so remember, Hitler amalgamated the offices of Chancellor and President into a new office of Führer. He does that in 1934. When he dies, he actually separates those offices again. He appoints Goebbels to be the Chancellor, but he appoints the Reich President to be Karl Dönitz. Karl Dönitz was a Grand Admiral. He was the head of the Navy. Dönitz was the head of the Navy. And Dönitz is in the north. Flensburg is kind of in northwest Germany. And he essentially creates a new government. He creates a new government there in Flensburg. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and Minister of War Production, he essentially makes him the new Minister of Industry. Sharon von Krosigk is the Foreign Minister. And he was kind of a Prime Minister and leading minister there. Wilhelm Stuckart, who actually attended the Wannsee Conference, who was represented the Interior Ministry, he is now the Minister of the Interior for the Flensburg government here. Now, very quickly, both Himmler and Ribbentrop show up in Flensburg, essentially saying, what is going to be our position in the new government? Well, Ribbentrop was just kind of an idiot, so Dönitz doesn't take him seriously at all. But he's kind of scared of Himmler. He's scared that Himmler still commands loyalty within the SS, and there could be some kind of a coup against this government. So he actually instructs, he kind of tells Himmler, we got to wait. We got to find something for you. We're just not yet. So he kind of is keeping Himmler on a short leash, promising him some kind of government position, but not really giving him anything here. Well, here's the thing. Dönitz knows the war is lost. He's under no illusions, okay? He is under absolutely no illusions that the war is lost. But he is continuing to keep the war going. He wants the war to keep going because he wants to get as many German soldiers who are fighting the Russians, he wants to get them able to flee and surrender to the Americans and the British because they will be treated much, much better by the British and the Americans than they will by the Russians. So Hitler dies on April 30th. The war goes on for about another week while Dönitz is essentially saying, make your way west, surrender to the Americans, surrender to the British. And finally, Dwight Eisenhower knows what's happening, and he finally says, he puts out a thing saying, if you don't surrender within 24 hours, we will close our line to prisoners, meaning we will not take prisoners. If your guys come at us, we will shoot them. So now Dönitz is kind of, there's no real choice here. So he actually sends Alfred Jodl to meet with Bernard Montgomery in Reims, France. And Eisenhower was there, but he refused to be in the same room with him. So Bernard Montgomery accepts the surrender of Jodl. What happens is, that is on May 7th. And Jodl is, of course, the Wehrmacht chief of operations with OKW. Well, the Soviets, so they signed the unconditional surrender instrument. Eisenhower sent a statement to George Marshall in Washington. It said, quote, "The mission of this Allied force was fulfilled at 3 a.m. local time, May 7th, 1945, Eisenhower. We did our job. This is exactly what we need to do." However, the Soviets were very unhappy. The Soviets were very unhappy with what had happened, and they insisted that the Germans surrender to them. So while they're in Berlin, there was the acting chief of the general staff was a guy named Hans Krebs. And he had actually spent time in Russia. He spoke fluent Russian. So they sent him to sign the instrument here, along with Wilhelm Keitel. And you see Keitel there in the bottom left. Keitel was, of course, we talked about him a while back. He's the chief of staff of the OKW. And he surrenders to the Russians there at Karlshorst, which is kind of just a part of Berlin there. The building today is a museum, and it's really cool, and you can see the room where they actually signed the thing there. But this was May 8th, and so this is why we consider May 8th to be VE Day. Marshal Zhukov oversaw the ceremony here, and representatives from Britain, U.S., and France were also in attendance. And with the surrender of with this document, the war in Europe is over.